Noam's presentation will now address more of the grassroots, right? We've been talking about top, bottom, governmental policies, institutions. We now have a look from the ground, and I think a lot of the intersectionality, the issues you raised with the various other forms of identification comes clear out of the example of the women you worked with. And I think also that spaces are, from my experience in Rwanda, spaces are created and are available where identities can be acknowledged and other forms of connections made. And I think that it's not as gloomy as the top-down picture is. So if political association cannot be based on ethnic identities, I think when you go to the communal level, there's less fear of expressing and acknowledging one's own ethnic identity and engaging in a discourse with the other in a more kind of friendly and low-key way. So I think that still exists in Rwanda. And that counter picture is something I think Noam, probably from our own experience, will talk about. So thank you very much, and I'll give you 15 minutes as well.
I'll leave some more time for questions since everyone are talking about so many inspiring things, and my orientation is less academic, so I have this kind of, you know, more personal testimony that speaks a bit about the national narrative in Israel, the national narrative in Rwanda, and how my work fed into this. And Sigal, you're being very modest in how you speak about Rwanda. I was privileged to be in one of the last Gacaca courts because of you, one of the last cases. Sigal, if you're ever thinking about visiting Kigali or Rwanda, you should speak to Sigal before, because the places she'll get you there are very interesting. And that's where we met for the first time as well. A lot of the issues of identity that you spoke about, and also some of the sensitivities that are today going on in Rwanda. There is a recent BBC media publication, which some of you, yeah, you're nodding your head. This is, you know, I visited Rwanda for the first time in 2009. Now, you know, throughout the recent years, in terms of when we're talking about the national commemoration on a national level of the genocide, is being shifted a bit. There are a lot of sensitivities, and there are more and more difficulties in voicing any kind of criticism on the Rwandan government and on the Rwandan national narrative. However, I'll go back to, you know, to my first time going to Rwanda. I grew up in Neve Shalom Wahde Salam, which is a Palestinian Jewish community. All my life I embodied both narratives. I grew up, my grandmother is a Holocaust survivor, and I grew up with the Israeli narrative and with the Palestinian narrative, coming from a family and parents that have very, very different views on how the national narrative and how acknowledgement of others' suffering needs to be acknowledged on a national level. And this is, you know, my being and how I was raised from a really, really young age. And, you know, the unfortunate examples, you know, not of us as individuals, but on a again, on a national level in Israel, our inability to recognize other suffering and the ways in which the Holocaust is being used sometimes and commemorated in Israel actually sometimes defeats the purpose of the essence of the memory and the suffering of the Jewish people. This brought me to look for in other places. My second year in university at Brandeis, I told myself that I was a coexistence scholar with another Palestinian, and we were supposed to talk about the conflict. And I told myself, I can't do this. There are other places than Israel and Palestine. Let me just go over here to Rwanda for a second. And I didn't know that I'll be so stuck on Rwanda. But one of the first things that struck me, and again, this is with keeping in mind that this is my own individual, you know, this is not an academic paper, this is my individual take as someone, you know, and there are many other aspects and many other things going on. But in 2009, having all of this in mind, walking into the Genocide Memorial in Rwanda hit me very, very hard, because first of all, everyone around me were like, why are you going to Rwanda? What can Rwanda teach us that you cannot, that you don't know? And it was that first day in Kigali, stepping into the genocide memorial, when I saw something completely different. And this is again this is the Yad Vashem, this is the national, you know. So I walked in and I was with some Rwandan youth there who were there for the first time. Their families are survivors, and it was very also, I mean, they were completely traumatized, and there was a lot of drama going on there. And I found myself in the middle of a lot of youth groups also, and I walked in, and one of the first things I saw is that, for those of you who haven't been there, you know what I'm talking about. A whole floor is dedicated to other genocides, and a whole floor is dedicated to the mechanism of hatred, the mechanism of suffering. There is a corner there for the Armenian genocide. I stood in front of this and I was like, what, how, what, I mean, Israel helped, you know, you cannot talk about the Armenian genocide in the place where we need to be the heart of the never again, you know. So all these thoughts and everything. And then I got to another section where there was there were testimonies there, and then I realized that some of the testimonies are testimonies of killers, of perpetrators. So I walked in, then I was like, wait, and I actually went back to check that I'm thinking straight, if that really is the case. And there is a whole body image of a killer explaining how he was sent by the constructors of the genocide, and he was told that these cockroaches need to be murdered, and if not, him and his wife. So whether or not that's true, whether or not that dismisses him from anything that he's done, kids, Rwandan kids, walking into their national memorial center in Kigali, witnessing this, knowing that some individuals had simply no choice, but there is a larger mechanism here, and there is some kind of acknowledgement to what the ones who were perpetrating the genocide had to go through in the process of their national catastrophe. This is a completely different national narrative being told, you know, right there. It's not perfect, there are criticisms, but these are the two, you know, main things that really struck me and stayed with me as I was there. When I arrived, I was immediately drawn into a very, very unique initiative of Rwandan women called We Act, which is Women's Equity and Access to Care and Treatment. This group of Rwandan women, 10 years after the genocide in 2004, they're basically, you know, dying from AIDS, and they were survivors of sexual violence during the genocide. They were completely neglected, had no access to antiretroviral ARVs, HIV treatment, and it hit them that they're reaching the end when they were hearing that in the international court systems, and also in some of the court systems that were being established in Rwanda, their perpetrators in these prisons under international law were receiving the treatment that they, as survivors in the field, were not being received. So they were basically, you know, they're survivors of the catastrophes, not only Tutsi women, also Hutu women, who their husbands were sent on purpose to commit sexual violence because they were HIV positive. And this group of women viewed and this is a big part of the healing narrative in Rwanda, women who, in a lot of spaces in Rwanda, realize that there is very little acknowledgement for Hutu suffering in Rwanda. But in many, many spaces, in cases of women, specifically women who are HIV positive, who it's very, very well known that their husbands in particular were sent to commit sexual violence again, they are being brought in to this kind of reinforcing and trying to build this national narrative together with Tutsi women who, you know, survived this sexual violence, and together they have a very, very strong voice. And I was brought into this work to mainly develop the youth section, which was very, very challenging. I don't know. You know, it's always very, very tricky as outsiders when we come into something that needs to be sustained, that needs to be locally owned. And I was coming in, you know, as an outsider, but we wanted to make sure that we're developing some kind of a system that is sustainable for the youth, so that they can maintain it. And what's wonderful, I think, with the young generation in Rwanda, and in particular, I mean, the youth that I was working with who were experiencing, dealing with HIV status, which is, I mean, one of the most devastating aftermath of what happened in Rwanda, is what the youth is left with. It's these are the memories. Some have memories in your heads, some have memories in your physical trauma, and some are they're still carrying it as a form of HIV. So it is a big part of what Rwanda is dealing with now, and the way the youth are dealing with it from all sides, because some of them are children of perpetrators, needs to be dealt with a lot of seriousness. And what we were doing in the clinic is actually trying to see how peer mentorship and how young Rwandan leaders can develop programs which at the center of this is actually healing from HIV, which gives a kind of a strategic space for youth to feel like their narrative is being acknowledged, like their narrative is being, and again, because there is very, very little space for recognition of Hutu suffering, when you are a son of a perpetrator who was born into this, or you are a child that was born out of the rapes of the genocide, this is, again, this is a part of the national story. And when the youth are dealing with this together and are actually developing together programs that in the essence of this is health, is their unity to bring more youth to the clinic, so that they know that through their story and through their healing there is really place for everyone. And the fact that their mothers are the ones who enable this is another testament to Aya, to what you were saying. This is completely and this is just one small example, but Rwanda is really full of these examples of women who came forward, and I always I'm a bit hesitant about using words like forgiveness and reconciliation and transitional justice, and there are a lot of examples of this, but on the individual level, many of the women I worked with, they say that they really don't forgive. They're really not moving on. That all these, big words of reconciliation, and I mean, the fact is that when you have to live next to your perpetrator, this is not life. I mean, two of the women I worked with throughout our work together saw their perpetrators in the market and had a complete collapse, and in the middle of trying to rebuild your life. So this is always in front of you. This is the reality you're facing day by day. And a lot of the people I worked with were saying that it has to do with sacrifice. It has to do with stepping out of yourself. And I'm not forgiving. I'm not forgetting anything. I'm not letting go of anything that happened to me. But I'm just letting it pass right now so that my children will not have to witness what I witnessed. And this doesn't only speak, to Tutsi survivors, because there are. I mean, everything is so sensitive, and so many, and so many Hutus feel, unacknowledged, feel unrepresented. I think the recent term of the genocide. I mean, you're only allowed to use, Tutsi genocide, genocide against the Tutsis. All these little steps and terms, and the whole discussion about. Kagame's policies, and whether there is a time and place for everything. So maybe what he's reinforcing and what he's struggling about, maybe it's good for the few years after the genocide, but now it's time for something that is a bit different, for something that allows more criticism. And all these discussions are always there. And I think that if we care about Rwanda, and I think there is a lot of connection between Israel and Rwanda, not only on political issues and identity issues, on historical issues. I mean, Israel played a role in the genocide. We have also a responsibility There are really, I think Rwanda is opening an embassy here in January, reopening the embassy in January. That's what I heard, and there are talks that, you know, Rwanda and Israel connections are being strengthened. So, you know, if we care about Rwanda, we have to keep in mind that exactly what you said, that, you know, there has to be room for criticism, and there has to be room for the narrative not to be viewed from one side. And I think it is coming from the young generation, from my experience, and we have to stay attentive to that. Yeah, I can answer more questions.
Thank you very much for an amazing presentation, and the fact that it comes from your personal experience, I think, is one of the most interesting aspects. I do find also that there's a very vibrant civil society, women's group, especially in Rwanda, that do connect across the ethnic divides, and also don't shy away from acknowledging their own ethnic identities. And I think that's under the radar. I mean, it's not that it's quiet and hidden, it's just it doesn't rise to the political level where it will be impeded. So it still exists. It's not secret. They just don't organize into political parties, and they can exist. So it's not as bad as the outside critics present it in terms of, you know, the closing down of political space in Rwanda. I just wanted to comment what you said about the Israel, for those who don't know, Israel's role in the genocide. It was basically arms deals that went on that originated in Israel and ended up with the Hutu genocidaires. There's a question of whether the authorities in Israel condoned it, encouraged it, or even knew about it. That's an unanswered question, but there were bullets made in Israel found that were used to perpetrate the genocide. And weapons, arms as well, yeah. So that is that. There were arms and weapons of different countries in Europe and Egypt and China, et cetera, et cetera. Huge involvement of the international community. And I would think that it's not just Israel and Rwanda that is interconnected, but all humanity. And all humanity must see these challenges and take part in preventing hatred, genocide, and no matter if you're Israeli, Rwandan, or another community of genocide survivors or not, but this I think is the idea, and I think nowadays Rwanda is very isolated in terms of the international community. There's a lot of criticism which throws the baby out with the water, because A, people are not seeing the beautiful things that are happening in Rwanda, and they're not giving a hand to help. There's no constructive criticism, almost a bashing exercise at the moment, and they're leaving Rwanda stripped from aid, financial aid, and other forms of aid. Of course, this excludes the Dutch are still very much assisting, and other countries are still assisting certain projects in Rwanda, but to the most extent of the Western powers, I think aid is no longer there, and ostracism instead takes place, and I think this is a negative approach. In any event, I don't want to take more time from the discussion stage of our session. There are 35 minutes for questions and answers, and I'd also urge the other participants to ask questions of each other. You want to raise your hand if you have questions?
Yeah, okay, so the first question was whether the representation, the very high representation of women in Rwanda's parliament actually affects the gender reality of the country, and what is the meaning of actually having a majority of women in the parliament. And I think this really connects to something that both Yigal and Noam mentioned regarding the criticism of Rwanda's political system. And maybe I can elaborate a little bit more about that. So I think it goes back to the question of if we do see that part of there is a bigger gender change in Rwanda. So there are more rights for women in the economical and political levels, and women get equal education now, which they didn't get before. So there is a real change in the very basic rights for women. But comes the question, what made the Rwandan leadership actually push for gender equality? Okay, and this actually relates also to the second question. So if you ask the RPF themselves, then they would say the gender equality was part of our agenda to begin with, because we are a disadvantaged refugee group, and we were very much aware with every suffering of every minority group, etc. Okay, if you look at public statements of Kagame regarding gender equality and the other ministers in the government, they usually quote either the very economical benefits of equality or like pragmatical benefits of equality, or they rely on perceptions of women as peace facilitators and as bringing reconciliation. And then if you look at the criticism from outside, so there are some researchers that would claim that the RPF actually took advantage of gender equality to hide very problematic trends and negative trends in the transition of Rwanda to a democratic society, such as suspicion of corruption in the elections, over cooperation between the civil society and the government, the narrowing of the political space, prosecution of objectors to the government, and the official policy that forbids the mentions of ethnic identity, as Eagle very well explained. Some even go as far as saying that the choice to promote women was done under the assumption that women will be less of an opposition, that women will put less objections into this process of narrowing political space and will be so grateful for being promoted and being given an opportunity for actual participation that they will not be giving the government any troubles. Let's put it like that. So that is like the main lines of criticism if you take them from the lighter criticism to the harsher criticism. But I do think that even if we accept that the motivation of the RPF for promoting women was not honest, okay? Even if we accept that criticism, I still think that you can say that the situation of women in Rwanda has improved significantly. And that improvement cannot be taken away from them, even if we suspect the motives that pushed it in the first place. And you can really see it in a lot of aspects of life. Even if you look at the reintegration camps for guerrilla fighters that are being brought back into society from the jungles of Congo, etc., they even have a gender program in the reintegration camp where people are taught about the new gender order in the new Rwandan society, etc. So it is taken very seriously. And I think if you look at what happened in the other study cases that I've examined in Macedonia and Northern Ireland, then it looks like a very dim choice, like either have gender equality but no actual free democracy, or have a real democracy with no gender equality. And overall, if you go to the final chapter of conclusion of my thesis, it's not very optimistic. The only really optimistic part of it is the power of civil society, which I think is the most important thing in all of the three cases. And the second question, as for donations and Western aid, actually, if you look at the international community's involvement, so it's true that donors often make demands as to gender equality in grassroots projects, in underground, but the international community is not actually promoting gender equality on the political level, which is the aspect that I was dealing with. So if you look even at the involvement of the international community in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, in negotiating the Macedonia peace agreement, they did not insist on including women. They were not even that helpful with assisting accepting the demands of the local women groups. And Rwanda was less dependent on Western money and more on African money and the Rwandan diaspora. And I think actually overall the involvement of the international community in promoting gender equality on the political level is very counterintuitive. It's not that helpful, and many times the demand is not even being made. Like, no one insisted on having women around the table in the Good Friday Agreement, for example. No one in the international community, I mean. So it's not necessarily, like, I think, but the international community did fund in both Macedonia and Northern Ireland and Rwanda a lot of women empowerment projects, economic empowerment and social and community. But still, there were projects funded by the international community in Northern Ireland, for example, where women has gained very important community roles during the conflict and were asked to step down for prisoners that were discharged from prison and needed a job. So not always, which by the way is just another point. If you look at I think there is a very strong correlation between gender status in post-conflict and prisoner reintegration processes, because in Rwanda, the reintegration of prisoners included, for example, the gender education, and you see a better gender status post-conflict. In Northern Ireland, women were asked to step back for the prisoners, and the status of women is way worse than in Rwanda. So that is something that I thought might be worth an extra research, the correlation between DDR and women's status.
Let me just add something. I think it's very interesting, and I don't think any of you noted it. I'm not sure. Maybe I missed something, but it's very interesting that the Rwandan post-genocide constitution includes a provision that at least 30% of parliament and other government institutions must be women. So women must account for 30%. Now, how did that provision reach the Constitution would be the question to ask also. I mean, was it the international advisors? Was it any aid program, et cetera? I think a lot of it was a Rwandan form of advocacy and pressure. There were international advisors in the constitutional reform. And I think a lot was also done by the Rwandan government in terms of looking at foreign examples for inspiration, looking at other constitutions for inspiration. But in any event, probably there were a variety of causes that led to this provision in the Constitution that is the starting point for insisting on the representation of women. So in other words, there's a quota, so there's a minimum, and initially it was the minimum that was reached. Only later, through, I guess, the success of this project, that more and more women were voted into parliament and other national institutions. I think now a lot of effort is being done with the police, because the police didn't reach the 30%, and there's a lot of affirmative action now in Rwanda towards involving more women in the police forces. There's also a gender ministry that leads huge gender mainstreaming projects that are very, they go down to the level of the smallest communities, and they're built in that kind of hierarchical way. So there's a lot of top-down efforts, and they try to make it to the community level. Yeah. All right. Any other questions?
Thank you. I think the question in large was, I'll try to elaborate more on the issue of the national narrative and the uniqueness of the Holocaust and the memory in general. It's I have a lot of thoughts, in my head to try and elaborate on this more. There is my personal story. There is the Palestinian narrative. There is the Israeli narrative. There is the Holocaust, which is always the elephant in the room. I think at the essence of this, and what has been driving me from a very, very young age, because of my family's history. My family's history is divided. My mom is from Iran. She was born in Iran. She has a very, very strong Middle Eastern identity. My grandfather came to Israel with the Quran. He was used to reading the Quran. And my mother speaks Farsi to her mother. And on the other side, my dad, his mom survived a Nazi camp. This combination of my parents raising me with the Palestinian narrative all created a mess. But a good mess. A mess which at its core, I think I discovered that the Jewish people, because of our history, because of what we've been through, we are in a special position to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone, anywhere. And even more specifically and more painfully, to the ones which we are responsible for their pain, which are the Palestinians. And this is a very, very sensitive topic. It's something that I've been dealing with and being criticized on all my life, because I'm always viewed, as the one who grew up with Palestinians and who acknowledges Palestinian suffering. My personal story and my personal outlook on this is an example that this doesn't have to be threatening the other. to live with full respect to the Palestinian heritage, to the catastrophe of the Palestinian people, while knowing that my history doesn't need to be erased. There is no threat to my history or my identity, and there is a way and spaces where when we acknowledge this, but acknowledging it and reconciling the past truthfully, we can actually sustain our own future. I think that when we start realizing that, I mean, no one will ever take away from the Holocaust, the Jewish suffering that happened in the past. No one can ever touch this. I know what my grandmother has been through. I don't need this very, very militaristic and over-nationalist narrative that re-emphasizes how the Holocaust was the biggest catastrophe that happened to humankind without linking it to other mechanisms of suffering. It doesn't do any good. It just differs us from actually connecting to the world, in my opinion, connecting to the Middle East, which is where we live. There are the other narratives of the Jewish people who came from the Middle Eastern countries and were living in Muslim and Arab countries who didn't experience, I mean, my family's history from Iran also was never taught to me in high school. We are only taught the European perspective, which is important, but what are the messages that our youth is getting from it? And this is why when I entered the Genocide Memorial in Rwanda, I saw what I never saw in my own in the Israeli narrative. And I'm not saying it out of happiness. I'm saying it with pain, because there is so much room for us, especially because we are Jewish, that we need to know how to treat others, that we need to start, not acting so defensive and not acting as perpetrators who need to kind of hold the trophy of the Holocaust to justify other things, but we need to start opening up and admitting mistakes and reconciling the past is the only way to reach truthful security, in my opinion, here in the land we want to live in. So, to make a very, very huge elephant in the room very, very short, it's those aspects of the national narrative in Rwanda that I saw that I want to start seeing in the national narrative in Israel that is missing. And to say the last thing, we're all being faced with criticism. These are sensitive issues. Probably if this was a different audience, you would be throwing tomatoes at, I don't know, but there also comes a time where, I mean, khalas, we have to speak. I think there is a different generation that is open to start hearing different things, and just because of risks or fears, or I'm already receiving criticism, so it shouldn't scare us, I think, from speaking of this. And because my grandmother suffered in the Holocaust, and no one can take that away from me. My family suffered from this. Because of that, it's important that I will be there and say these things, and also point out to actual examples where we can learn from. So I think the essence of this is realizing that acknowledging others' suffering in the end will bring more long-term security, and actually a far, far more, I don't know, even a human narrative. In the last year of high school, I went the bilingual school the bilingual school I attended was only up to 6th grade. After that, I went to an all Jewish high school, and we went on a senior year of high school right before most of the kids in the Jewish schools go to the army. We go to the death camps. There are tours, and we were forced to carry the Israeli flag in the death camps. There was a complete dissonance between what's going on in the hotel, in the parties, and then in the morning to wake up and go to the death camps. Just the whole national narrative that is being very, very in a complicated way being brought in. We have to revise it, and we have to do that more carefully, and it's you know, sooner or later people will wake up to see that I mean, the Holocaust cannot be used for political motivations. It cannot be used. It's something that we have to learn from on a human level, and if we're not doing that on the educational level, on the governmental level, it's a big no-no. So that experience in high school, together with everything else, this is a bit of what, you know, brought me into that.
Thank you very much, Noam. It's very thought-provoking, I think. It hits a chord with all of us.
Yeah. So the question was if the big fishes, the high-profile perpetrators, were actually, if it was possible to judge them through the Gacaca courts, and actually if you're saying that the comparison is not fair because if it wasn't the ICTR, it would be the Rwandan courts. And then you're asking about the criticism about the faults of the Gacaca courts, which is right. I read the Human Rights Watch on the Gacaca courts, which has both the pros and cons, all the good sides and the faults, and I kept it to the end just in case there was a question, because I was so keen on presenting the positive side of it. So I have it ready for you. But as you mentioned, yeah, I agree with you. The Gacaca didn't have the means and the mandate to arrest those high-profile perpetrators, especially that a lot of them has fled the country and they were outside, and you needed the cooperation of different governments to be able to bring them, to arrest them, and to have them brought to court. So in that sense, only with those few perpetrators I agree. But my question was, after the ICTR didn't have more resources, and the main two resources was time and money, a lot of the cases were actually switched, where they were given to the Gacaca courts to deal with. And I was wondering, why wouldn't that have been done a bit earlier, with acknowledging the good work of the Gacaca works? Because at some time when you didn't have any more money and you were about to, it was time to close the ICTR and finish the work, a lot of cases of not of stage one, not of the high perpetrators, but of other stages, were actually transferred to the Gacaca courts. So
From the National Courts of Rwanda.
Yes, and yes, yeah, but actually.
So there were two phases. At first, the National Courts of Rwanda, who had the mandate over perpetrators from the worst perpetrators. At one point, they redefined Category 1, right, to move to Category 2, some of them, and then they moved to Gacaca. But then later on, they even moved some of the Category 1 to Gacaca. But the transfer was from National Courts of Rwanda to Gacaca. Right?
Yes.
Not from ICTR to National Court.
Maybe to the from the ICTR, then to the National Court, and then to the Gacaca. Finally, they got to the Gacaca courts.
No. The ones who were transferred from the ICTR to the National Courts were not then transferred to Gacaca. They are still in the National Courts. And that was also in a later time. And they're even in special National Courts.
Okay, but the rephrasing of the one who were rephrased to be in a different phase, yeah, got actually to the Gacaca courts at the end. So that was my question of why not having at the Gacaca court at an earlier time, and not because of lack of resources, but because of acknowledgement of the good work they did. But as you mentioned, I agree that there were some problematic aspects of the Gacaca work functioning, such as, yeah, it was difficult at times to assess, for example, how if the training given to the judges was enough to prepare them to give actually to decide on genocide relating cases. The public actually who participated in the hearing couldn't be relied upon to denounce the false testimony and miscarriages of justice. There were a lot of opportunity for twisting and manipulating evidence that wouldn't have been in the ICTR. And another one that actually a lot of the survivors have complained that people who were supposed to be punished were not punished, were not sentenced, and some who were convicted and sentenced have had their punished being changed by individuals, private individuals, and government authorities that manipulated the course of justice. So there are faults to the Gacaca courts. I didn't say it's perfect. I was just emphasizing the positive side of it. Okay, you bring me back to the connection to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I was about to talk about with relating to what Noam addressed. Okay, yeah.
Very short answer.
He is very right in that, because that's could go really long, because that's a big part of my life, like being a Palestinian, living here, being an Israeli citizen, with all that comes with that. There is actually a similar model called the Sulha. And actually, every time I read about the Gacaca, I felt it's quite similar, where you have the respectable people of the community, persons coming to be mediators between two groups or two individuals, and it still happens on a community basis, but it wasn't kind of blended with legal standards, just like what happened with the Gacaca courts. So there is some model. I didn't think of it because I didn't honestly think of how effective it could be here, even though Truth Commission about and dealing with the narratives of the Palestinians about 48 could be really good, and we were part of that initiative at Zukhrot. From the Gacaca, I would take that. I would take the sharing the truth and having the public hearing, and giving the space for the Palestinian narrative. That would help a lot in my eyes in reconciling. But on a short note, regarding your question to Noam about how a person is able to get out of his own perspective and his own pain and his own suffering and his own narrative, national narrative, to be able to see others. I went to Rwanda with reading about the Hutu and the Tutsi and how the division was made. How I was looking for who is the Israeli and who's a Palestinian there. I was honestly measuring skulls, looking at noses, and checking who is who, and asking who's Tutsi. And I was whispering at times to Zigal because I didn't want to ask the locals. And I was quite confused. At times I thought, oh, the Tutsi are the minority, so they're the Palestinians. But then at times they were the powerful ones, and they are the powerful ones now, so they are the Israelis. And that made it hard for me to connect with one side over the other, connecting it to, oh, which side is my side in the conflict here? Which is good. Now I'm happy about it. But back then, I remember I was searching for that all the time. I was busy with it. I also had an education that very much gave the space to the other, and we had never had my parents are nationalists, but they never had that hate speech or hate attitude or that divisionist approach of they and us and this and that. So that was never in me, but rather the side that connects to anybody who's oppressed, discriminated against, which is the more of the human approach. I really agree with Noam that something about education here should change from a very young age, and that's what I try to do, not through schools, but through the facilitation of dialogue and conflict resolution groups that I do to introduce some different narrative and different take on the reality to both the Israeli Jewish and the Palestinian kids. And usually I challenge the Israelis more because on the Palestinian side I'm quite familiar with what they feel and what they think. So I believe it begins and ends with education.
Thank you to all the speakers.